But I knew the pain, I knew the suffering, I knew the despair, I knew the loneliness, I knew the hopelessness. And if I could help one human either come up out of that or avoid it entirely by developing relationships, genuine relationships with people and sharing my experience, my strength, my hope with others, well, then maybe that day when I meet God, I could say, hey, remember that first half of life? Let's wash that out with the second half of life, you know?
Welcome back to the Pay It Forward podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Austin Seward, along with my co-host, Keegan Walls. And today we have my good friend, Brett Knutson on. Brett is the president and CEO of Driftless Recovery. He is a high school football coach at Caledonia, all-around good human being, passionate about mental health awareness, specifically in the younger generation, empowering young people, athletes to be a better human. I am super honored to have Brett on, one of the most genuine, kind-hearted people you'll ever meet, a ton of wisdom to share. So very excited to have you on, Brett.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here, gentlemen.
Absolutely. So why don't you share with us a little bit about Driftless Recovery and what you guys do, the services you offer?
Sure. So Driftless Recovery was opened in April of 2014. Started out as just being a clinic, not just being a clinic, but being a behavioral health clinic, serving dual diagnosis. So those who struggle with both mental health, like you think anxiety, depression, things like that, but then also substance use disorders. Started out with just a couple of us there, and now we've grown in. I think we have seven and a half providers, we'll say. Have an MD on staff. And when in about 2016, we expanded the clinical side into also providing sober housing for men, and opened up the first Driftless Recovery House in about April of 2016 as well.
Awesome.
So,
and where did that passion for mental health and addiction, where did that stem from for you?
For me, it was a personal story. I in my personal life, I struggled with substance use disorders, which led to mental health disorders, things like that, for many, many years. Back into high school years and even post-high school is when it really picked up. Found my way into recovery at about 27 years of life, and found the courage and strength to turn everything around and decide to start living life. Mm-hmm. So at that point, it was one of those debates. I'd completed a college degree. I was working in the engineering fields. Ironically, I was working in part on designing breweries. I had done some contracts with Anheuser-Busch. Had done some contracts in the local area. Probably not the best place for a person with alcohol problems to be working, but at that point, that's all I'd done, and there was really no passion in that, right? And I think that was when I look back at my use and when I talk about addictions medicine, or when I talk about substance use disorders or addiction, as you want to call it, I never look at the substance itself as the problem. The substance is kind of like the carpenter's hammer. It gets the job done, right? And what job is that doing? And at that point, for me, it was really numbing, right? In a time when you're extremely lost in life, you have really no direction, you have zero self-confidence. It's good at numbing, right? I was never really good around big crowds of people, so I had a lot of anxiety. Discover alcohol, I can talk, I can socialize, I can be a part of. But all of that, of course, then leads to a crutch, right? I didn't develop natural coping skills, and as a result, drugs and alcohol really became what I depended on to get me through my relationships, to get me through my day-to-day, on and so forth. But I really didn't have any passion, right? So I got sober, and it was like, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? What could I possibly do to make up for what I've consumed in life, right? And that's kind of how I look at it, is I didn't just consume drugs and alcohol. I consumed resources. I consumed energy from other humans. I consumed resources of the community. I let 1 million people down, right? I let myself down. I let my family down. I let so much down. How do you build that up? And then, another thing that I got away from, we were raised in a church, right? Mom was a Sunday school teacher. Grandma was the choir director. Grandpa was on the church board. We were very much raised in that environment. And, life and my lifestyle took me away from all of that. And so the redevelopment of my relationship with God and spending a lot of time in prayer and, what do we do here?
Yeah.
Right? What's next? And so it became kind of this contemplation of my next steps in life. I have to be passionate about. There has to be some meaning behind it. And I wanted to be able to give back. All I really knew at that point, I talk a lot about blueprint. Every human is presented with the opportunity of having their own unique blueprint. You can define that pieces of it as good or bad. I look at it as all an opportunity. But I knew where things started for me, right? I knew where things had gone bad for me, and that was part of the process of getting sober and getting my mind right, just getting my head straight. Was being able to be humble and honest in that approach of where did things go wrong? What could I have done different? Things like that. But I knew the pain. I knew the suffering. I knew the despair. I knew the loneliness. I knew the hopelessness. And if I could help one human either come up out of that or avoid it entirely by developing relationships, genuine relationships with people and sharing my experience, my strength, my hope with others, well, then maybe that day when I meet God, I could say, hey, remember that first half of life? Let's wash that out with the second half of life,
Yeah.
And that's really what was the driving force behind it. So I had a counselor that tried to help me out several times in life, a gentleman by the name of Todd Huff, pretty notorious man around the area for helping young people in need, and fortunate enough to say that he now works for Driftless. But I went into his office and I said, I want to be a therapist. I want to do what you do. I want to help other people. And he sat back and he looked at me and he's like, you're nuts. I said, that I am. In fact, I am. But this is what I want to do, and this is why I want to do it. And he didn't bat an eye. He got to work helping me, and I got back into school and, earned the degrees and everything in order to do that. And, that was really Driftless by name. Wasn't in my head at that time. The name of Driftless wasn't in my head, but the planning stages of developing my own system and developing a company, in part because I had seen a lot of counselors in my life, and through that process, you meet people that you vibe with, you meet people you don't, and you see things you like, you see things you don't like. So just trying to take all of the experiences that I had and build something unique, build something different. Everybody's different, right? Every human takes things in differently, and you have to respect that in working with people in a therapeutic fashion. Not everybody responds to the same type of stuff, but I think there's some commonalities, right? And we have to have purpose. I think God built us in a way that we have to be able to give and receive love, and we have to have a purpose. We have to have something that gets us up out of bed in the morning, right? And so that was really, the start of it. I had planned this in my head for quite some time. I'd even started doing some in my internship phases and practicum phases. I had started doing a lot of like policy and procedure type stuff. And, so I was working 10, 11-hour days at a nonprofit in a internship. And then I'd go home and I'd sit in the basement and I'd do research with the state of Wisconsin on how does this, how do all these things work? And so kind of a learning process. It took a few years before we could really get it to where it became something that could become something. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So there's a big, you kind of have to put your ego aside to ask for help, right? So for somebody who's struggling with addiction or mental health, like asking for help is kind of that first step. So in your personal recovery journey, what was that prompt to you that like, this is it, I need help, like this, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah. So you're talking about what in the recovery worlds, in the people talk about rock bottom. What is your rock bottom? Some people's rock bottom can amaze you. I work with young people in my clinic that have died 10, 11, 12 times. I know a young man that has been flatlined at least a dozen times. The last one, he was deceased long enough before Narcan brought him back. He was deceased long enough where his muscles started to decay. And he was in the hospital for about 3.5 months, and he had to learn how to walk again, learn how to talk again, learn how to do all these things again. And that still wasn't his rock bottom, and so people hear those stories and they're like, that's crazy, but, and yeah, I mean, it is, but, for me, it was just, tired of the repetition. You know what I mean? You can only get sick and tired of being sick and tired for so long. And at that point in life, the reality is I had two decisions, and that was, end life or move forward. And move forward was the better option in that. So it was really just honestly a repetition of this internal dialogue and this constant just, what the hell is going on here? So that was really kind of the rock bottom. Now, I had several incidents in my life where a person could have said, why wasn't that rock bottom? Why wasn't that rock bottom? Can't tell you that. I don't know. That's that God thing.
Yeah. In your experience in working with people, is like, for somebody who maybe doesn't feel like they're at rock bottom, they still have a choice, right? I don't want people to feel like they have to hit rock bottom to make a decision. If you have not, and you're struggling, you still can make a decision without hitting it, correct?
Oh, you can absolutely make, you can create bottoms for people.
Yeah.
And that can come in a number of different ways, but this is why I like working with young people so much, right? You build a relationship and you try to build that trust and that understanding. Yeah, I'm an old dude, but I've seen a little bit of life. And in my process, I've learned a lot about this. And the thing about, substance use disorders, mental health disorders, they're brain diseases, right? So a person goes into the hospital with diabetes, right? Or you're pre-diabetic. You can go in there and they can run blood tests and stuff like that. No, your sugar levels are too high, or your blood is stating this, so we can, predict accurately that you are pre-diabetic. If you change your lifestyle, if you stop eating at Burger King every day, if you stop, drinking 13 Mountain Dews a day or whatever. Yeah. If you change your lifestyle, you can prevent yourself from continuing that process into that full-on disease, right? With substance use disorders, our symptoms are our behaviors, okay? Because it is a brain disease, right? And there isn't a test that can go in and crack your skull open and say, yep, you definitely have this. And so our symptoms are presented to society as how we behave. And so what does normal society see? Society sees, theft and robbery and domestic assaults and fights and all of this just wild behavior, which then only adds to that stigma and that label. It's a hard thing for people to wrap their heads around, how that repetition and how when the brain gets into that mode, how hard it is to come out of that. Because again, we train our brains like how athletes train their body. It's repetition, right? Repetition, repetition, repetition. When Tiger Woods steps up to strike a golf ball, he doesn't say, okay, I've got to hold my arms at this angle and I've got to be at exact this pitch and swing. No, he just does it, right? And the process of becoming addicted or dependent on a substance is a matter of becoming repeatedly exposed to a substance and stimulating your neurotransmitters, right? So when you're unnaturally modulating those neurotransmitters that are responsible for our mental health, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, your brain then becomes dependent on that outside source to produce any of that, or at least a functioning level of that, right? And so through the process of using to cope with life on, not dealing with life on life's terms by turning to alcohol or drugs or something like that, you're training your brain through repetition that I don't have to deal with this, right? And you understand that the brain works mostly on subconscious or unconscious processes. So subconsciously, unconsciously, you're training that brain to understand, if I use, I will feel better, right? If I use, I can avoid this stuff. And so what does that do? Well, it does a couple things. It trains you into this dependent mode, or this understanding that I don't have to work hard at anything. I can avoid all of this. And it's quite effective, right? But it also resituates or rewires your brain in a way that you're not going to get ample enough serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine for your brain to function, so you look mentally ill, right? You have a lot of the symptoms of organic mental illness, but it's created by this alcohol or drug dependence. So
can you talk more on like that balance, right? Because I think obviously mental health has come a long ways in recent years, right? But there's still tons of stigma to it.
Mhm.
But when you're talking about the combination of addiction and mental health side, like where is like, at least in your experience, do you see a lot of addiction as the medicine to the mental health?
Mhm.
Are some people just more prone to just actual addiction, or where's that balance between actual mental health and addiction? Where
This is I do, and this is part of the growth in the industry, part of the growth in the research, right? There's so much more to be learned. Again, it being a brain disease, it's much harder to study the brain than it is to study other organs, right? It's hard to keep you alive if you've got your skull cracked open to be able to study stuff like that. But in my experience, it's, I don't see people with substance use disorders that don't have mental health issues. Now, that the percentages start to shift a little bit of people who had maybe discovered that there was organic mental health, like that was the horse before the cart, and then the substances help to alleviate that piece. Or is it, a lot of times people in their young ages, they don't have any preceding mental health conditions, but as a matter of wanting to, again, feel love, feel purpose, feel a part of something, they'll find themselves at a keg party, or they'll find themselves at some social event, and they don't want to be the lone one left out, so they'll consume, and then they have a really good time, and then they start to equate in their minds that this is attached to that. But then, again, understanding that, like with getting high, right, it's not necessarily the drug that's getting you high. That drug resembles very much the neurotransmitters that are responsible for our stable mental health. Again, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. So when a person consumes, say, cocaine, their brain is just filled with dopamine, right? Because it overstimulates the dopamine centers of the brain. Well, that feels really good to the brain, right? But then the brain has to heal from that. It can't stay high, right? So then it starts to kill off some of these things, some of these receptors, to try to reach back to its equilibrium. Well, in that process, it's usually going to kill off too many. So then you feel a little bit lower when you're sobered up, right? That's called withdrawal, or a hangover, if you will, right? Yeah. Now, in the process of like heavier drugs, the next time you use, you're going to have to use a little bit more just to get the baseline, and then a little bit more just to get a little bit higher, right? So the highs never get the same high, but the lows will always get lower. And that's kind of the process. It's not a steady process. So in that process, right, where there's not an organic preceding mental health condition, you create one with your exposure to certain environments, right? And then what you're doing in those environments, obviously, as well.
So what's the science behind on the recovery side? You talk about all of these dopamine, serotonin that your brain is dependent on the recovery side. Like, what is the science behind that? Because your brain still wants that. What does that time frame look like that your brain starts to rewire back to normal?
Again, everybody's different, right? How a person heals, everybody's different. And I think the easiest way I always try to explain to people, like, how do things affect us? We've all been in situations, maybe at taverns or parties or whatever. You put 10 people drinking alcohol in the same room, you're going to have the happy drunk, you're going to have the sad drunk, you're going to have the dramatic drunk, you're going to have the angry drunk. It depends on the person and how they're wired and how they're going to behave or how they're going to react. And the same is true for the healing process, okay? You'll get through a lot of the major withdrawal stuff within the first couple weeks, but then the healing process, to where the brain is trying to figure out, okay, what is equilibrium? What is my baseline firing here? That can be months, years, depending on what a person's consuming. The drugs of abuse now compared to, and of course they were around back in the late 90s, 2000s when I was consuming. We just never did them. It just wasn't something that was done. And nowadays, I've got kids as young as 13. The first drug they've consumed is heroin. Oh my gosh. That's just like starting out the gate. The first thing they ever used was heroin. Mm-hmm. That's strange to me, but that's the reality of the world we're living in right now.
Yeah.
So you expose 13, 14, 15-year-old brain to chemicals of abuse like methamphetamine and heroin, which are two very well-known substances abused by man that will actually change the mass structure of your brain. So you start to inflict that kind of damage at a very, very early age. The reality is that there's some permanent damage that's going to occur in that, and that's where you get these sad stories of long-term ill health.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's go back a little bit more into like your own personal journey with it, and then before we dive more into your treatment and other patients and things that we're seeing in the world. What were some of the early days of your journey in terms of like the addiction before the recovery? Like, were there different circumstances or whatever? I know you said like, oh, go to the party and it makes me feel cool, but a little bit more even below the surface. Like, what were some things going on in your life that, right, I started using these things to cope, or and then some of the challenges, right? Just the life that happens, because a lot of times you're doing some of that stuff. There are like I feel like you're not always like aware of it in the moment, but then a lot of times, like during the recovery or after the recovery, then you start to understand. Okay, that's why I was doing this.
Absolutely.
Take us through some of that.
Yeah, I mean, you never. I've never met a single human that's known in the moment why they're doing what they're doing. Right? It normally requires some clarity and some time to heal before you can just be humble and honest and look back and why was this occurring. And for me, I look back even into my, gosh, I can look back to preteen, where I just never felt confident in myself. I might have portrayed that, but inside I was broken. I always use the statement to people like, I could go in, like we could roll up downtown 20 deep and I'd still be the loneliest, saddest person in the room, and I just always kind of had that overwhelming feeling. And this, it's probably a surprise to some that maybe haven't seen me or heard from me since I've gotten sober, if they end up watching this, but I was pretty good at putting on a front. And it was all not realistic, right? It was all just very much here that was broken. But when you're consuming, you feel good for a little bit, right? And so then that's what you start to want. Nobody wants to feel hopeless, lonely, sad, out of place. Nobody wants to feel that way. And so if there's something that can fix you really, really quick, there it is. And that didn't go on across my whole life. There was moments where there was great purpose and great humans that came into my life. And, unfortunately, for me, again, when I look back, it's like, why don't you just take that motivation that your coaches gave you, that senior year in high school? Why don't you take those words of wisdom and that love that they showed you? Why don't you take that and continue building? Well, in my mind, I think at that time I probably was doing that. I really wasn't. It was a moment in time which just, to me, added another loss. I wasn't looking at things like what a blessing it was to have Coach Neil Hoven and Coach John Blievdy, legendary Westby football coaches. What a blessing it was to have them in my life at the time. And to this day, those guys probably don't know how influential they are to me. A lot of the words that Coach B said to me or Coach Hoven would say to me, those still ring through my head in my business planning and how I work today in my current life. But, again, when you're in the moment of it, you don't really get to take those things forward with you. You're just not there. But, so for me, I think it was definitely lack of self-confidence. Didn't feel like I didn't know where I belonged. You know what I mean? And so then I would try to fit in anywhere I could fit in. And then I just have this enormous anxiety of knowing that I don't fit in and knowing that like, why this is just all fake. Then it just really starts to turn.
So then who were some other influential people in that at that time, or was there a pivotal moment that you recognized this? And then what were some of the things that helped you break that cycle of addiction?
So we talked a little bit about this off camera. I mean, there's a number of different people that I consider to be influential in my life. And it's different people at different moments in time, right? Like in high school, Coach John Blievdy and Coach Neil Hoven, Westby football, absolutely critical humans in my life at that time. And I, to this day, said they saved me from a lot. Moving forward from that, Todd Huff, great man in my life. My dad obviously had a major influence on me in life. My grandpa, My grandpa's one that, like I say, we go back into talks about faith as a young person, very involved in the church when we were younger. And then all of a sudden there was kind of a separation. We still believed in God and still had those discussions and things like that. And he's the one that said some words to me that, rang so true in my heart at that time. And it was pretty simple. He said, sometimes to get closer to God, you have to take yourself further from the church. And that made a ton of sense to me, right? Wasn't bad-mouthing church. He was talking about developing your relationship with God, and that exists far beyond just going and sitting down someplace on a Sunday and smiling for all the other folks that are there. You know what I'm saying? Those were powerful words. And, in my worst days, days where I, had spent some time in jail and things like that, they would always show up. You're only allowed one visitor, but they would always let my grandma and grandpa in together, right? And it always broke my heart watching them walk down that hallway. But they would always show up in my life. Very, very influential people in my life. Moving forward in life, I was introduced, again, moment of God here, but was introduced to Coach Carl Frichte over in Caledonia back in about 2016. And he's been an amazing figure in my life in so many ways, and continues to be to this day, and our relationship has grown. So many people that I've met, and you talk about people who are influential. Some people are very significantly influential, and other people are influential. Like how do you gauge that, right? Every interaction that I've had with people at certain moments in time, I think has with those people specifically has been an amazing blessing.
So for your recovery, then, did you go into like a Driftless Recovery Service?
Rehab, yes, I went to rehab. Yes.
You went to rehab.
I did go to rehab, yeah. I went into rehab and I needed it, man. I needed that so bad. I was at my wit's end. Again, it was one of those, literally those, do you live or do you end it type situations in life where you're just so overwhelmed and so fed up with everything. And then it was just this realization of like, you did this. You can get yourself out of it, And so then, to kind of continue that conversation of most influential people in my life, my wife, right? Stephanie at the time, like, she knew what she was getting into. We were dating when we, when I first went to rehab, or we were actually married when we went to rehab. We got married in September of 2006. I went into rehab in April of 2007. But why she married me, I have no idea. Like I was a wreck. I don't, I'm not proud of those years of my life. But, like I'd said earlier, there's that saying of, behind every good man, there's a strong woman. And I get the point of that, but she's always been in front of me, clearing the path. She's always been my cheerleader. She's always been the one saying, you absolutely can do this, So I went into rehab. And I needed that. I think rehabs are a phenomenal thing. I wish that they were funded better in current situations, right? They're extremely expensive. Back when I went to rehab, that was still covered very nicely by insurance. Nowadays, it's very, very hard to get insurance to cover rehabs. For me, what it was an opportunity to remove myself from my life situation for a little more than a month, where I could just focus on healing. Without that, there's no way I'd be here. No way at all I would be here. Met a guy, you talk about influential guys again. Eddie was my counselor down there. Phenomenal man. He was a big Puerto Rican, tattooed from head to toe, but had the kindest heart and just understood, and had a lot of history himself, so I could relate to him. Still have a good relationship with him today. But without that time away from my normal routines of life, like I talked about Tiger Woods in his golf swing, right? Just routine. My life's routine was so incredibly unhealthy. There was no way I was going to get out of that unless there was an immediate something, right, that could pluck me from that. And again, Stephanie, we're dating. She was at UWL at the time, working at Freight House on the weekends. And, I was at that time earning pretty good money as an engineer. She didn't care. Stop what you're doing. You got to do what's best for you. And supported me the whole time. She'd come down and see me there and things like that. But it was absolutely life-changing. The things that you learn in rehab, the opportunity you get to get in touch with yourself in rehab. One of the things they have you do is journal. And there was again, go back to understanding. You asked about like moments. This was one of my biggest moments. They have you journal, right? And they give you kind of an outline of how do you journal, what to journal about, things like that. And I'd sit in this room, in a nice room, right? You got this nice leather chair, and it's all fancied up for, it's supposed to be a great room to do this stuff. And I would just get so frustrated and walk out of the room, and I'd slam the door back. Eddie, I'm not doing this. This makes no sense to me whatsoever. None of this is working. This is all BS. And he would stand over me like a 6'4" Puerto Rican and be like, "You are going to do this." Yes, sir. But I did. I wanted to be so different. I wanted to live different. I wanted to feel different. And so I didn't give up, and I kept going on it. And one day sat in there and I was writing for probably, 2-3 pages, say. And I grew frustrated and I left it and I walked out. Well, I left my journal pad in that room. And the next morning I woke up and I was looking for it. I'm like, I left it down there. And so I went down and I had breakfast with some guys and went back into the room. And this was my first reconnection with God, in my opinion, right? I sat down and I read what I had written the day before. And I absolutely broke down in tears and I bawled and I cried in just this like cleansing cry, because I realized at that moment, everything that I had written on that page was bullshit. I was in such bad shape in life that when it was just me, an empty room, a pen and a piece of paper, I couldn't even be honest with myself. That broke me. That absolutely broke me. Eddie opened the door a couple times and shut the door, let him go through it. Cried until I felt like there was no more moisture left in my body. And I picked that pen up and I started writing, and I dated it back to when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And I just worked my way forward, and it was the most therapeutic, wonderful experience I've had in my life. It was painful. It was hard, but I was honest, and that was all a product of going to rehab. That wouldn't have happened in my normal routines, So it was a pretty important piece of my story.
Yeah, and that's powerful.
Yeah.
So to shift a little bit, we live in a culture that, like, the older generation, you talk about mental health and like very tough, blue collar, don't talk about that. And now we've shifted, I feel like, on the opposite side where everything is a mental illness and just become a lot more soft, right? So there's a lot of people self-diagnosing themselves with mental illness. Where's the line between this is legitimate mental illness and this person just needs to toughen up a little bit?
Yeah, and that's a tough line, right? Yeah. Because everybody's different. That's a tough question. I see it every day.
Yeah.
The thing I always tell people is that if there's a problem, there's multiple solutions. Pivot to the positive, work the problem, right? And as you're working that problem, right, you're going to gain a lot of insight. You're going to get stronger, but I guarantee you're going to run into another problem. When you do, you pivot to the positive and you work that problem and you continue to grow that way. You guys know this in life, right? It's not easy. Life's not easy. You're going to run into struggles. You're going to run into troubles. You build a resiliency and you just become more aware of yourself and what do you have control over? God gives us control of our attitude, our effort, and how we choose to respond, and that's it. How do we choose to pursue that problem? There are times where I think that labels, people dive into the definition of something. I think most people experience anxiety, right? Most people experience bad days, and you could label those depressed days. sad days. Everybody's going to experience that. To reach a clinical level, though, that's a difference. And I wonder sometimes if I think the emphasis on mental health is a very positive thing. Don't get me wrong, but I also think that sometimes there's a line that's being blurred between what clinical mental health is and what, I don't know if we'll call it social mental health. There's a difference there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, because I've talked to my wife about that before. Just because either in my own life and then my upbringing as well, have been very much in the world of mental health and had family members and parents and stuff struggle with stuff. So that's always been a part of my life. But that's what I've seen so much of that in today's society of, oh, well, I'm depressed or this or that. And maybe that person is, but I the easiest way for my mind to think about it is like, okay, yes, everybody gets sad, but like depression, like, so then when I think it hurts us because when we mislabel like depression, and when somebody says they're depressed, everybody else thinks, okay, they're sad. So they can get up and just go to work. It's like, you don't understand. Like, sad isn't depressed where I can't do anything. Like, my body's physically, like, my brain is shutting me down to I physically can't move or do anything. Like, that's depression.
Yeah.
Same with anxiety. We all get stressed. Anxiety is this, right? Like, it flares up and it overtakes you to a point of a panic attack where it's like your brain's on fire. There's not, like, that's anxiety. So when we mislabel it, I think I think it comes from a good place of trying to promote and shed good light on the stigmas of mental health. But I agree that I think sometimes when we mislabel it, which is a little bit of what we're doing in today's society, it actually takes back away from the real patients of mental health, the people that are addiction and depression and actual like clinical anxiety.
Yeah.
Just a huge difference between I'm stressed and anxiety, which is, I mean, it's like a dark cloud, right? Like,
yeah,
it's not
different.
not stressed. I said, because I've had like moments of like legit panic attack. I said if stressed is anxiety, I'll take stressed every day compared to legitimate anxiety. I will take stress 10 out of 10 times.
Yeah.
I can work through stress, but like real deep anxiety, it's tough to get through.
It's tough to get through, and unless you've experienced it, it's hard to explain it. You know, and you know, this is one of those subjects that's so difficult to talk about because in no way, shape, or form are the three of us sitting here discrediting anybody that feels like they have some mental health stuff going on. But at the same point, like you're saying, when you've experienced panic and it's just this mind-numbing experience of, am I dying? Where am I? What is going on? Like you have no idea what's going on. Or you've experienced that type of depression where it literally, you describe it as like your soul feels like it's empty, like it's missing, and this heavy weight where it's just this pain, right? Not like, oh, I missed the bus, I'm sad. There's a major difference there. But then, again, I think the only way, and this is what we try to do at Driftless all the time, is like the only way to differentiate between the two is to develop a relationship with that human to determine what is their perspective, what is a person's ability to cope, what is their level of resiliency, right? What have they had to overcome in life, and can you use those former examples, right, to help them come up out of what they're needing help with at that point. So it's a really touchy subject. It's a tough subject. Social media is somewhat, I think has gone a little bit too far in trying to glamorize mental health stuff. And so, you find, I've got a 6-year-old, an 11-year-old daughter, and a 14-year-old boy. Now they don't get to mess around with the Instagrams and Snapchats and stuff. They don't have phones and things like that. But, they still just around in their peer environments. My 11-year-old was talking about like, well, I think that person might be bipolar. You're 11 years old. What do you know about bipolar? You know what I'm saying? Like, how does that even come into how does that even become part of like what you're talking about? So it's, I think part of it too is trying to figure out what the definition of it is for that individual, right? For every problem, there's an answer, though. I truly believe that.
Talk more about the social media. That was going to be my next topic. How has that changed, like, mental illness in general, mental health?
I think it's more than that, man. I think it's just changed.
Talk more on that, yeah.
I think it's changed dramatically us as a society. Everything's too easy. Everything's too accessible. You know what I mean? Like, I think in many ways it's, it's obviously, I mean, it's had an impact on how adults, young people, how everybody communicates. It's too easy to just DM someone, right? Snap someone. It's too easy. The art of actual having eye-to-eye human conversation has just gone out the window. It's amazing. And you talk about how it adds to mental health. You create your own little world sitting there staring at that screen, right? You don't have to go out in society. You don't have to do that stuff. You can feel a part of something right here. But that's not how the real world always works. So when you have to go to school, or you have to go out and you have to interact with other people when all you've been doing is this, boy, that makes it real hard. You know what I mean? But beyond that, I mean, where could we go with this conversation? You talk about imagination. Kids don't have to have an imagination anymore. Just scroll on to the next thing. Something else will bring entertainment. Imagination is a very powerful thing for humans, right? How to create, how to chase, how to do stuff like that. Finding happiness, right? Sometimes in the right places, sometimes in the wrong places. But again, if that's not pleasurable, if that doesn't bring you satisfaction in some way, next scroll, right? It's just a constant, it's too easy, right? My kids always, it kind of drives them nuts that I'm like, the amount of time that young people spend on those things, it takes away from life experiences that are going to make you better adults. And, I always use the example, we grew up out by Westby, and we'd ride our bikes down to our buddies' houses down in Coon Valley. I mean, we're talking 10, 11-mile bike ride. Well, a 10, 11-mile bike ride, no big deal. Yeah, we're doing this at like 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. It's not the ride, it's what happens on the ride, right? Your bike breaks down. You got to flip that thing over with your buddies, and you got to figure out how to fix that. How does this thing work? I got to fix this thing. You can't just pick up the phone and call mom and dad or text somebody, come get me. You got to figure that stuff out, or you're stranded out in the middle of nowhere. You know what I mean? All of these experiences, I think, are being taken away. And I know that this old dude ranting about technology. No, there's truth to it, right? You don't have to seek. It's all right there in your hands. And it's, again, I think that it's just made the world too accessible. And then you talk about drugs, right? You get into the dark web stuff. I got kids in rural communities that get half ounces of heroin delivered to their house out on rural farms via the United States Postal Service through the dark web. The access that kids have. There's cook menus on there on how to make meth and how to make LSD and how to do all this stuff, right? Again, the world's just gotten far too big, and it's not that no technology is the answer, but what is the answer? Just, let it just be the way it is and just grow into this huge unhealthy thing, or start having some controls and moderation on that. And then who does that? To me, it's the parents, right? To me, it's the parents. And this is where I say it's not just young people. Big problem we see at the clinic a lot of times is kids getting ignored because mom and dad are spending too much time on their phones, right? Trying to do their TikToks and try to do this. And it's like, come on now. So it's not just a problem that's impacting the young people. It's, then you get into bullying, cyberbullying. Man, has that been an issue, and that's come up so big since the, particularly over the lockdown period of COVID, and how it's grown and evolved since then. It's so sad to me,
What do you see happening over the next 10 years? I mean, social media isn't going away. There's only more platforms, more advanced stuff, AI coming out. Like, what is your prediction on what's going to happen over the next 10 years?
That's a tough question. In my heart, I want to hope that family units become stronger. My hope is that communities, schools get stronger and start putting their foot down on some of this stuff and starting to understand how evil lurks behind those screens. That's my hope. I think the reality is that machine is so big. How do you contain it? You look at the, you talk about big pharma, talk about big tech, and the influence that has on people. Worries me.
Yeah, I think what you said, it starts at the family unit and the parents, because Big Daddy government should not be the one telling people what to do and what not to do. It should
Correct.
come from parents.
It should come from parents, right? I mean, the schools aren't going to parent your children, and I'm not talking bad on schools, but they're not going to parent. That's not their responsibility.
Yep.
Government certainly shouldn't parent your children.
Yeah.
Right? That it's up to the parent to be able to do that stuff. What worries me though is that, a lot of that iPad generation, that those people that were born with iPads, and they're going to start having kids soon. Right? So we're kind of running out of that generation that grew up with, BMX bikes and running around outside and loving. Had the old GT Performer here, but the Mongoose was quite the bike too.
Yeah.
But those days are, those days, and then that type of memory is going to be gone here soon, right? And so then, how does that grow? It's gonna be really interesting.
So what's your advice to the parents that want to provide a level of protection and education to their children in that matter?
Pay attention, right? Don't, I say limit time, and there's all sorts of different science behind why you should limit time. Physiologically, sleep cycles, circadian rhythms, things like that, and why you shouldn't have those phones in front of your face hours before bedtime. There's all sorts of science on that, but I think above and beyond that is just knowing what your child is being exposed to, right? You wouldn't let your kid just wander off into the world with a stranger. Why would you let them wander off into the web with strangers all over? Know what they're doing, be able to, and again, here we go with a fine line, right? Do you want to smother your children and be the guard in their life and take everything and things like that? Or do you want to sit down and take the time and have those conversations about what the potential dangers are, what your expectations are, what some of those limitations are, and then allow them to make their mistakes, but allow them also to find their successes? I don't think any parent wants to be a, lawnmower parent that's just trying to push over anything that represents adversity. At least I would hope not. They do exist. I know that, but, again, pay attention.
Yeah.
Be a part of your kids' lives, understanding that it's changing. Like I always tell young people now, that 14 to 21 is far and away the most significant developmental transition of a human life, and how you work those years and how you navigate those years is really going to determine your future successes or your perceived failures. I'm not a big failure guy. I think everything's an opportunity, but a lot of people still interpret losses and things as failures. But those are such critical formative years. And in many, many ways, in popular thought or not, a lot of our kids are being robbed of that natural development because they're growing up thinking, I got to wear these clothes. I got to listen to this music. I got to look like this. And if I don't look like this, then I'm hopeless. I'm a loser. I'm blah, blah, blah. It's trash, right? Yeah. So,
and that's the crazy part, though, is I think most parents or at least in my world, a lot of people would agree with what you're saying of, well, yeah, that makes sense. But then it's just the ease of, it's just easy, right? To just because then I don't have that tough conversation, because then it's, well, my kid's going to be the only kid without a phone.
Yep.
Everybody else has one.
Yep.
And so it's like, well, it's just too easy. So it becomes this monster of, well, everybody has it, so I guess I have to do it too. But then it's convicting to me too, because I have a son. He's 2 years old. But think about how much he sees dad scrolling, right? Mm-hmm. What's crazy is watch a little kid on like an iPhone or whatever. They're 2-3 years old.
They know how to work it.
They can swipe to the next picture. To me, that's disgusting.
It
literally grosses me out. It's gross.
Well, look where they're taught that though.
Yeah.
Like you go into school. My daughter's in first grade. She's got a new iPad. Yep. The school gives them these things, right? And it's not blocked off from YouTube. They can look at YouTube.
Really?
You know what's on YouTube.
Yeah.
Paid Forward podcast.
That too. But it's a huge world, right? And so they're being trained in this stuff. And so again, you go back to technology and easy.
It's just the easy, but it's the new up and coming addiction, because it is an addiction.
100%.
And parents, like you said, again, convicting to me, parents can start it by not being on their phone so much, but they can't even get off themselves. Mm-hmm. And so now it's like I have this own crutch, and instead of me taking like a pill or whatever, and we say, oh, I'm not addicted. Well, you are addicted. Like, if you have an iPhone, it's going to tell you every Sunday how much time you spent, how addicted you really are to your phone. And it's an unreal number. And that's how much time you've wasted. And then we just start to become idols of ourselves, right? Like what you're talking about is I can just start to form the world how I want. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like this. we're just
And what
self-idolatry.
and what is it doing then? What is it doing? You're saying, well, I don't like this, I'm doing this. It's learning what you like and don't like.
Exactly.
So then all of a sudden it becomes everything that you really like. And then how do you set that down?
So the world that becomes myself, I love this.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's all fake.
It's all fake.
not
Every bit of it's
reality.
fake. Yeah.
It's literally social media. It's not reality. So then you go into reality and it's like, no wonder we can't find any enjoyment, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, because guess what? Social media is all about serving me. And then I go out here and guess what?
Mm-hmm.
No. Like life is not about being served. It's about the opposite, in my opinion, is serving. So no wonder it's crazy.
Yeah, and like I say, it starts with the family. You go back to you talked about, well, are some just getting soft? Parents.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, they won't have a phone. Everybody else. Who cares?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Because in 5-6 years, you're going to reap the rewards of that decision, right? Right now, we might have to deal with a little bit of attitude. And by the way, if you don't think it's an addiction, take your teenager's phone away from them for a period of time and see how they behave. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Kicking, screaming, swearing, breaking things. They're going to be freaking out, right? Take a phone away and tell me it's not an addiction.
So in that regard, like you look at the treatment and rehab that's involved in alcohol addiction or drug addiction, not to say that any addiction is more or there's better or worse than others, but like, do you think eventually there will need to be more intensive treatment for phone addiction, social media addiction?
Absolutely.
I mean, you look at porn addiction, that wasn't a thing 50 years ago, 30
There was
years
gambling
ago.
addiction,
For sure.
food addictions, things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's going to be a thing, and it's going to be a market that I think is going to absolutely explode.
Yeah.
Because you have an entire generation that's dependent for everything. And that, when you talk about addiction, just flip that word with dependence, right?
Yeah.
You're dependent on these devices to bring you satisfaction in life,
Yeah.
right? In most extreme cases.
Yeah.
And even when you're seeking entertainment, right? It's right at the hands, right there, right? What does that do to relationships, right? Yeah. You think about these things, and again, I got a bit of a weird head, but you think about these things in terms of like just marriages, right? You can plan and prepare a night out and go on a date and go for a walk in the park and then end it with a movie or something like that. But how often is that interrupted by just you get scrolling and like, this is just as entertaining. I can just stay here. I don't see any need to build onto that. You know what I mean? It's just such you can go down so many different rabbit holes with it. And again, technology is not going to go away. And we have to be realistic about that. Moderation, right? Moderation, understanding what limits are, understanding what the evils are of it, and understanding what the potentials are of it, and having those open, candid discussions, leading by example, right? Being good leaders in our communities of young people.
Yeah.
And how we do that.
So changing topics just a little bit, but still on recovery and addiction, you've mentioned God and your faith. How big of a role has that played in your life and where you are now, and even in your business or helping other people recover?
Huge, right? And again, this is another part that I'm not a big fan of society right now, right? And it's this discussion of God. And if you talk about God, well, you're this and that. It's like, no, I'm pretty open about the fact that that's what saved me, right? And I'm pretty open about the fact that it was me that took myself away from him, but he never left me. I have not, and I can say this with 100% belief in my soul, in the countless thousands of humans that have come through my office doors, I've never seen somebody fully recover without God in their life in some way, shape, or form, right? Now, again, that doesn't mean that this person's going to church all the time, but they've developed a relationship with their higher power. They've developed a relationship with God. We could go on and on about that subject, right? And I think that's something that's missing, again, in part of this world. But kind of go back to the early discussions, what role does it play in my life now? I believe that God sees us best fit as a community, right? Love one another, care about one another. You go back to that old saying of, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, some of us adults are children, right? It takes a little bit of help. I'd said earlier about how, my lifestyle, my choices, my decisions to step away from God, that was me. That was my humanness. God never left me. But when I fully understood what I was doing in life and how I needed to correct that, he needed to be the driver, right? And so God's will, not mine, right? That helped me immensely with understanding what I'm in control of, right? Situations happen, things come up, stuff that used to baffle me because I couldn't control it. Something would happen, something would go on. Let it go, right? It's like you just kind of start to learn how to deal with life on life's terms. I tell every person that comes into my office that there's going to be a discussion about this. Are you comfortable with that? And I think what's amazed me over time is that, and this might shock you guys too, but sometimes I'll get parents that'll say, no, we don't want to do that. And that's fine, right? Like I'm not one-stop shop, right? We might not click, and that's fine. If that's the case, I know about every therapist in town, every organization in town. I can make an appropriate referral and get you there, and I'm happy to do that. But I at least have to be open and honest with you that this is going to be a part of our discussion.
Yeah.
I've had parents balk at that, and I've had kids say, no, I want some of that.
Really?
Yeah. And that's super cool.
That's awesome.
That's super cool,
Yeah.
right? It's the kids saying, no, I'm good. Or they'll walk out with the parents saying, no, this isn't going to be a good fit for us. But then a week later, that kid will show back up and it's a good fit for me.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cliche way of saying it is we all have this God-sized hole in our heart that, or the God-sized hole in our heart that only He can fill.
Yeah.
Whatever, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what I was never in addiction or whatever, but a lot of that struggle was all, I call it my BC days before Christ, right? 'Cause you're trying to fill whatever, and then it's like when I met Him,
Yeah.
holy, like you don't even realize that that's what I was chasing. It's because we're not doing who we're created to be and what we're made for.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And that's really where my drive comes from every single day, is doing God's work in everything that I do. Helping, and my belief in my doing God's work is I'm helping people discover the best, truest version of themselves possible, right? And so that doing of God's work comes in everything I do, whether it's housing, whether it's the clinic, whether it's coaching football. A big part of it's coaching football and having that attachment to kids and that relationship with kids in that world. But that's doing God's work, right? Helping people become the best, truest versions of themselves. Nobody wants to suck at life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, people want to find that peace. They want to find that success. They want to find the best way of living. They want to be content. They want to feel good. And finding ways to do that permanently without altering your reality with fake substances or social media, things like that. What a blessing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you used our hot button word, success.
Yeah.
And so in your line of work and in your life, how do you define success?
That's a tough question. Success is an interesting word to me. I've had people say, "Oh, you're very successful in this and that." I don't necessarily consider myself successful. I think I've succeeded at many things. I don't consider, and I think if a person considers success based on your bank account, I think they're foolish. I don't know how I would define success. Success to me seems like a finish line. Like, I am successful. I've accomplished this. I'm not done accomplishing. I like to think that I've got a lot of good years left in me, and I'm not stopping, right? I'm going to keep trying to grow. I'm going to keep trying to do God's work in everything I do. Keep trying to grow Driftless, keep coaching football, keep having an influence on society in the most positive way I can, because for so many years I was a negative influence. Success is a weird word to me, man. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what that is. I know I'm pretty darn happy living life this way. And I feel very fortunate and blessed to be able to live the way I live today. That's thanks to God, no doubt. Thanks to a lot of people that hung in there with me, primarily my wife. I don't know what success would be for me.
That's why we love it, though,
Yeah.
is because we think it's a simple term, and that's why we ask it on the show. It's the whole tagline of our thing of redefining success.
Yeah.
And we're not redefining it for one definition. Everybody we've had on has a different definition of what success is.
Yeah.
And so
I think somebody else would determine whether or not I was successful.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and and it's not for me to decide that. I think how we live our life and how we're remembered is that'll be success. I'll never know if I'm successful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
somebody else can determine whether I was successful or not.
That's great. So to leave our listeners, Brett, what are some healthy habits somebody can establish in their life? They don't want that they want to be a good person. They want to be mentally healthy, physically healthy, just live a well-rounded lifestyle.
Mhm.
Like, what are some practical things somebody can start doing?
Well, I think first of all, understand like the components of health, right? And when I assess a human, it's always mental, physical, and spiritual, right? If you don't have good mental health, it's going to be very difficult to have good physical health. You're not going to have that motivation to get up and get moving, physical movements and stuff like that, whether it's going to a gym or whether it's just going for walks or whatever. You're not going to have that motivation, that discipline to continue to do that stuff. Obviously, you're going to have ill spiritual health if you don't have good mental health as well. So we talked earlier about a little bit of stigma in society. I have this great project going right now with Aquinas Catholic Schools here in the La Crosse area, where we're going to have a full-time licensed professional counselor employed at Aquinas, available all school days, and then carry on through the summer, obviously, in the school, right, to provide education. And part of it is, I was over at their Gold Gala the other night, and I said, look around. Such a great school in how they promote the student athlete, right? How they promote the arts. Obviously, the spiritual component is handled at Aquinas Catholic Schools, right? But mental health is so often completely ignored in the upbringing of our children, right? You have gyms, you have weight rooms, you have churches, you have all this stuff. But, mental health, don't talk about that, right? So I think having conversations about it, I think when you talk about mental health, it's more than putting a sign in your yard and saying, I support mental health. But having some discussions with your kids about how are you feeling, normalizing emotions, right? You had said it earlier, we're kind of pick yourself up from the bootstraps. That's unfortunate. You know what I mean? I think one of the strongest thing young men can do is acknowledge their emotion and get in touch with their emotion and understand what a driving force that is in your life. And it can be a very positive driving force, or it can absolutely destroy you, right? Practical things. I'm big on structure, okay? I'm big on goal setting, and I'm big on structure, and I'm big on schedule. We accomplish something, right? And I'm not talking you have to go in there and say, I'm going to have, whatever this giant goal is by the end of the year. No. I'm talking set goals for the day. I'm going to make it to every class on time, right? You have your schedule of how many meetings you have in a day, right? Yeah. But you have this all written down and you have this all logged out, right? You got to check that stuff off. That's all accomplishment. That's giving you a sense of accomplishment. Structure, schedule, discipline to that, right? Understanding all the components of mental health, physical health, mental health, spiritual health. I'm huge on journaling. I go back to my experience with journaling that we talked about earlier. That's not a unique experience to me. That's an experience of journaling, right? Writing about your emotions, talking about to yourself. There's a very strong therapeutic experience a person can have when they journal and they become vulnerable. Now it takes practice, right, to get into that discipline of being able to write and to have an honest flow of conversation with yourself, if you will. Journaling is a big deal. Reading self-help books, reading in general, right? Self-help books obviously can help you learn more about yourself, learning about other success stories and what helps people. A lot of times you're gonna benefit greatly from that. Even reading random books helps get that imagination going, right? Yeah. Reading books. I think that pen and paper is something super important. I think reading old books, not listening to audiobooks, doing stuff like that, but reading books kind of helps spark that imagination. But the self-help books, particularly as it pertains to mental health, learning about things, right? But I think those are fairly simple, practical things people can do. I'm also very big on meditations. Hyperice makes a product called Core. We've used it for many, many years now, and it's a kind of a meditation trainer. There's a directive, but then there's also a response from this orb that you hold. And the training of meditation, a lot of times people talk about meditation as a fixer for in-the-moment stuff. But again, how we talk about how we train our brain through repetition, right? When you're training your brain to meditate, which is truly a significant practice, when you're training your brain to meditate, you're developing these neural pathways that are calming, and you can access those through the process of learning how to meditate. You can access those in times of great stress or anxiety. And so trying to help people lean more towards meditations and training that brain. We'll go to a gym and we'll sit on a flat bench or we'll sit in the squat rack for hours. You can meditate 30 minutes a night, 15 minutes a night. It can have a profound positive impact on your outlook and your perspective. I'm big on gratitude lists, to be honest with you, as far as mental health goes. I think oftentimes life has gotten so fast, life has gotten so big that we don't pay attention to the small things. And again, so slowing down in your journaling and writing down things that you're grateful for helps shift that perspective, helps us to focus on positives. It's really interesting, when we talk about the social media earlier and things like that, it's very, very difficult to find positive in media sources, right? There's a war here, these people are dying here, this government's corrupt here, whatever's going on. It's just always bombardment of this negative. Us as adults feel that, right? And most of us have developed brains to be able to cope with some of that stuff. Imagine these teenage brains that are having to deal with all of these things, right? But having those conversations with young people and helping them work through some of that stuff and getting them to normalize the practices of mental health. It's not just a word. It's just like, you can't just say gym, right? And not go to the gym and work it, right? You have to work a process. There has to be a piece of that involves some leg effort.
Yep. Yeah, I love that and super appreciate you coming on. And yeah, I think it's a super important topic and glad you were able to come and share your expertise and experience and just your life and wisdom. And I'm sure it'll be helpful to people that are listening because, come on, every single person at least is or knows somebody struggling with something like this, right? I mean,
yes,
it can't be more than 2 people away from an issue like that. Maybe
it's
one.
pretty hard. It's pretty hard to find anybody that's not had a direct impact of some mental health or some substance use. It's just grown into that at this point. And again, thank goodness that there's you guys exist where we're able to have these discussions and hopefully normalize a little bit of it. If you need help, if you need someone to talk to, it's out there. Seek help. In our La Crosse area, 211 is a great resource. They have a number of different resources. Just pick up your phone, hit 211, and they can direct you to whatever you're looking for, right? Whether it's counseling or AA groups or NA groups or any sort of self-help group type stuff, 211 is a great resource for that. But have the courage to communicate, have the courage to speak up. You don't have to sit and fight a battle alone. You're not alone. People have fought that battle. It may not be your battle, but it's a similar battle. And I think the one thing that binds all of God's children is emotion, right? I may not know exactly what you experienced, but our emotion can be very similar, and that can then help us grow a relationship and help one another live the best lives we can.
Amen.
Right on.
Thanks for being here, Brett. Appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. We sincerely hope that you learned something today. And as always, we appreciate your support and hope you can all find a way this week to pay it forward.